Welcome as we review the reign of Napoleon. Napoleon Bonaparte rules as Emperor of France for 15 years from 1799 to 1814. Napoleon was born on the island of Corsica off the coast of Italy. He was not French by birth and grew up speaking Italian. When he was a young boy, France conquered the island. Napoleon Bonaparte's father was a member of Corsica's aristocracy. However, he was actually quite poor and worked as an attorney to support his family of his wife and 10 children. He's able to use his connections to get young Napoleon into a military school in France. Young Napoleon is very smart and very, very, very ambitious. The other young boys at the school all come from wealthy families and make fun of Napoleon because of his lack of money and his thick Italian accent. As a result, young Napoleon has quite an attitude. Napoleon Bonaparte does well enough in school to gain his commission as a lieutenant in the artillery corps, and his military skills get him noticed very quickly at the beginning of the French Revolution. So let's take a minute to explore why Napoleon Bonaparte is one of the best-known generals of all time. Military historians tell us that he had a passion of power and a particular genius for leadership. This genius for leadership was particularly strong in the areas of administration, the day-to-day running of the country and the army, as well as morale. His troops loved him and would go to great hardships to support Napoleon. Finally, Napoleon had a genius for tactics. Military academies in the United States and throughout the world still examine the battles of Napoleon to study his maneuvers, how he placed his soldiers and moved them around the battlefield. And as we saw in our last review, at the end of the French Revolution, facing a threat of invasion from Britain and her allies, Napoleon seizes power in what is known as a coup d'etat. In a reference to the fact that France had no longer had a king, Napoleon references finding the crown of France on the ground and picking it up with his sword. During the first 5 years of Napoleon's rule, he kept the form of the Republic and respected the ideals of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Perhaps due to his own humble beginnings, Napoleon emphasizes that position and promotion are given based on merit or ability rather than simply a title or family connection. But make no mistake about it, while he may have continued with the form of a republic, Napoleon Bonaparte was really a dictator. Most people didn't complain though, because after the craziness of the French Revolution, people were ready for some stability, and Napoleon did bring that. There are a number of positive things about Napoleon's reign as Emperor of France. First among those are the Napoleonic codes. Essentially, Napoleon had France's laws rewritten, and some of the concepts in the laws were so well done that we can still see traces of them in European laws today. Additionally, Napoleon becomes a champion of education, helping educate a great number of young men in France. And in this education, the best jobs went to those graduates who displayed the most ability rather than to those who had the best family connections. And finally, in the area of religion, the French Revolution had outlawed the Catholic Church. Napoleon, signing what is known as the Concordat, acknowledges that most Frenchmen are Catholic, and he allows the church to come back to France. The church, on its half, acknowledges that it will focus on religion and keep out of the politics of France. To make his power permanent and hereditary, in other words, so he could pass his power along to a son when he has one, Napoleon decides to make himself emperor. He holds a special election known as a plebiscite, in which the citizens could vote yes or no to a particular question. In this case, the question was, should Napoleon be made Emperor of France? The citizens voted overwhelmingly in his favor. Napoleon was certainly a master of self-promotion and public relations. Traditionally, the Pope would place the crown onto the head of the King of France, reinforcing the idea of the divine right of that absolute monarch. These images, taken from the works or the sketches of the person who painted the official portrait of the coronation, showed Napoleon in full self-promotion role. He takes the crown out of the hand of the Pope and places it on his own head, displaying that he was king through his own actions and not because of the church. Here we have the official paintings of Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte and his wife Josephine. As we said, he's a master of self-promotion, and he had many, many official portraits painted. One of the best-known paintings of Napoleon is the one we see here in the center. During the wars against Austria, Napoleon surprises the Austrians by marching through the Alps in particularly bad weather. This military accomplishment is genius, and the surprise defeats the Austrians. Napoleon commissions this portrait that shows him riding on a majestic war stallion and leading his men through the difficulties. But a look at the picture on the right shows that this painting may not be quite realistic. A skittish war horse would probably not be the best method of crossing through the narrow and icy paths in the mountains. Years later, another artist shows what that crossing probably actually looked like. Rather than a majestic war horse, Napoleon probably crossed on a donkey, who has much better and sure footing on the narrow, icy paths. It may be more accurate, but it doesn't inspire awe in the French citizens, so we saw the portrait that was commissioned. Napoleon's military successes began conquering more and more of Europe. As a result, Britain and her allies go back to war against France. To deal with this threat, Napoleon plans to invade Britain. To do so, he must first defeat Britain's strong navy. Otherwise, he will not be able to cross the English Channel to invade England. At the Battle of Trafalgar, one of England's greatest war heroes, Admiral Lord Nelson, defeats the combined French and Spanish navy, thus saving Britain from invasion. As Napoleon conquers more and more of Europe, he reorganizes things and places his family members as the monarchs of the countries he has conquered. Here we see it goes from Joseph as King of Spain to Jerome, King of the tiny Principality of Westphalia. Frustrated by his inability to invade England, Napoleon turns his eyes to the remaining European power that he had not conquered, Russia. So in 1812, having assembled an army of over 650,000 men, he invades Russia. As we see in this map here, it is quite a march from territory held by Napoleon to the traditional capital of Russia, Moscow. Russia is an incredibly large country, and as Napoleon invades, the Russian army retreats, luring Napoleon further and further away from his supplies. They use what is known as a scorched earth policy, burning everything as they go, leaving nothing for Napoleon's army to use as food or wood for heating and building. Napoleon actually captures Moscow, planning to use it as shelter for the upcoming winter. However, as he approaches the city, the Russian army sets fire to it and burns it to the ground. Napoleon now has a very important decision to make. Winter is approaching and Napoleon's Grand Army has no shelter and very little food. It's late September and Napoleon reluctantly decides it is best to retreat before winter hits. Unfortunately, the Grand Army doesn't make it before winter arrives. Between the freezing weather of the Russian winter and attacks by the Russian army, only 40,000 of Napoleon's Grand Army of more than 600,000 make it back to France. The other European countries quickly take advantage of Napoleon's defeat, and even those who had been forced to be his allies turn sides and invade France. They capture Paris in 1814. His army defeated, Napoleon is forced to give up all claims to the French throne. He is exiled to the island of Elba. The winning alliance restores the French borders back to what they were in 1790 at the beginning of the French Revolution, and they return the monarchy to France, putting in place Louis XVIII, who was the brother of the executed Louis XVI. I don't know whose idea it was to exile Napoleon to Elba, but it wasn't a very good idea. The island of Elba is very close to Napoleon's birthplace, Corsica. Very quickly, Napoleon receives assistance and makes his escape from Elba and returns to France. As soon as the news reaches Paris that Napoleon has returned, King Louis XVIII flees and Napoleon marches to Paris. This period is known as the 100 Days. Britain, Prussia, and the Netherlands send armies to stop Napoleon. They are led by the English Duke of Wellington, shown here. The combined allies defeat Napoleon at what is known as the Battle of Waterloo, in a village in Belgium. If you hear the phrase, "he has met his Waterloo," it refers to a final defeat. So the 100 Days was the last 100 days of Napoleon Bonaparte's power in France. This painting shows Napoleon at the end of his 100 days looking quite dejected. This time, Napoleon is sent to exile to the island of St. Helena, which is in the South Atlantic between Africa and South America. Napoleon spends his last days in St. Helena, where he dies. Europe celebrates the final defeat of Napoleon and convene a meeting of delegates from all over Europe. This meeting is known as the Congress of Vienna. Congress, of course, means a meeting or a group meeting. At the Congress of Vienna, the delegates work to restore order to Europe. Their guiding principles: those countries that had suffered the most should be paid for their losses, known as an indemnity. They should restore the balance of power to Europe so that one country could not be stronger than the rest, and under the rule of legitimacy, restore all the former ruling families that had been conquered by Napoleon and replaced with his family members. The impact of Napoleon Bonaparte's reign in France is really in three areas. First, we see some new political ideas, including laws in the Napoleonic Code, and the ideas of merit rather than family connection leading to positions of importance. we see the rise of nationalism. Those countries that are conquered or threatened by Napoleon rally together to defend their people or their nation. We'll talk more about nationalism in an upcoming review. And finally, in the concert of Europe, where Europe is working together, they look to maintain the balance of power so that one country cannot dominate the rest. Thank you for joining us as we reviewed the Napoleonic era.